A single black father gave shelter to a soaked, frightened girl during a storm. 3 weeks later, he was accused of kidnapping the daughter of a billionaire, and what happened next destroyed an entire empire. The rain came down in sheets, relentless and cold, as Soua stepped out of the hospital's back exit. The overhead lights flickered under the weight of the storm. It was 2:17 a.m. and the end of his night shift, a shift that had dragged on with emergency after emergency, but all he could think about was his daughter, Isabella, waiting at home. She had a fever that wouldn't break. He'd promised to make her rice porridge when he got back. As he crossed the nearly empty street toward his car, he caught a glimpse of something at the bus shelter. At first, he thought it was a shadow, just another illusion in the storm. But then lightning cracked the sky, and he saw her, a young woman soaked to the bone, hugging her knees, eyes wide and terrified like a deer trapped on a highway. No phone, no bag, just her trembling hands trying to stay warm beneath a torn hoodie. He paused just for a second. He was tired. He was needed at home. He had a child to protect. Logic said keep walking. She looked up, startled as he approached. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low but firm. She nodded too quickly. "I'm fine. Just waiting for the next bus." Her lips were blue from the cold. There were no buses at that hour, not in that part of the city, not in that weather. "You got a phone?" Andre asked. She shook her head. "ID?" She hesitated. "It got stolen. I'm sorry." That was all it took. One word, sorry, and the way she said it, like she'd used it too many times to strangers who never stayed. He stepped back. His mind shouted reasons not to get involved. But then he saw Isabella's face flash in his mind, his little girl shivering under blankets, whispering, "Daddy will be back soon." Andre turned, took 2 steps toward his car, then stopped. Rain poured off his hood, his clothes soaked through. He exhaled, slow and steady, then turned back. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but my daughter's at home sick. And if she asked me what I did when I saw someone freezing out here alone, I'd have to tell her the truth. That I walked away, and I can't live with that." The girl blinked, uncertain. He motioned to his car. "I'm not a creep, I'm a nurse, I can't leave you here. One night, that's it." 15 minutes later, they walked into his small apartment. The heater hummed softly. The air was warm. Isabella was curled up on the couch, a damp washcloth on her forehead. She opened her eyes slowly as the door clicked shut. Her gaze shifted from her father to the girl standing beside him. She tilted her head and said, in a small, sleepy voice, "Daddy, is she an angel?" Andre looked at the stranger beside him. Her clothes were dripping, hair matted to her cheeks, eyes red from the cold, but for a moment, something passed between her and the child. A silent kindness. He didn't answer. He just closed the door behind them, and the storm kept raging outside. By morning, the storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in puddles that shimmered beneath a gray sky. Inside the small apartment, the warmth of a new day settled in the corners of the kitchen, where the smell of cinnamon toast filled the air. Emma sat quietly at the small dining table, her eyes darting between Andre and Isabella as they moved around like any other family. Andre didn't ask too many questions. He poured her a cup of tea, placed it gently in front of her and said, "Eat first. We'll figure things out later." Emma had planned to leave that morning, but when she saw Isabella's flushed cheeks and the way the little girl clung to her father's side, she hesitated. "I can stay another day just to help," she said softly. Andre glanced at her, considering, then nodded once. Just one more. One more turned into 2, then a week, then 2. Emma began waking up early to make breakfast while Andre got ready for his shift. She taught Isabella how to braid her own hair. They danced to old songs on the radio while folding laundry. She helped Andre sort medicine for his elderly neighbors. No one asked her to, she just did. There was a gentleness in her hands, a sadness in her smile. And sometimes, at night, when she thought no one was looking, Emma would sit quietly at the window, staring out into the city as if searching for something she couldn't name. One Sunday morning, Isabella pulled Emma into the kitchen and said, "Daddy says I should help with chores now, but I want to help with pancakes. You're better than him at flipping." Emma laughed, a real laugh, full and bright. She showed Isabella how to pour the batter just right. That afternoon, they all sat down together. A meal of pancakes and scrambled eggs, mismatched plates, too much syrup. Nothing expensive, but it was everything. Emma put her fork down and stared at the table. Her eyes welled up. Andre noticed. "You all right?" She nodded but didn't speak. Then after a long silence, she whispered, "I've never had dinner with a real family before." Andre didn't say anything. Isabella reached over and handed Emma her favorite spoon, the one with the purple flower. It was her way of saying, "You're safe here." That night, the apartment felt fuller than usual. Laughter echoed down the hallway. Music played low. It was a rare kind of peace, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you don't realize you've had until it's gone. The next morning, Emma was gone. Her borrowed clothes were folded neatly on the chair. The extra blanket was refolded on the couch. On the kitchen counter sat a handwritten note. "Thank you for letting me feel normal again. I'll never forget it." Emma Andre stood there for a long time, reading the note over and over. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. Isabella came out of her room, rubbing her eyes. She looked around, confused. "Where's Emma?" Andre hesitated. "She had to go, sweetheart." The little girl frowned, her voice trembling. "But I called her my sister. Why didn't she say goodbye?" Andre didn't have an answer. Outside, the world moved on. But inside that apartment, the warmth Emma left behind lingered like sunlight in winter. Quiet, fleeting, and missed more than she would ever know. The sun rose like any other morning, soft and pale through the blinds of Andre's apartment. He was up early, as usual, buttoning his scrubs while Isabella sat at the table with a half-eaten bowl of cereal, swinging her legs and humming. It had been 2 days since Emma left. Her absence still hung in the room like the echo of a song that had ended too soon. But life, as it always does, kept moving. Andre packed Isabella's lunch, checked her backpack, and kissed her forehead before walking her to school. They laughed along the way. It felt like things were returning to normal. Then everything changed. At 10:43 a.m., Andre's pager buzzed. It wasn't a medical alert, it was from the hospital board. "Report to conference room 2, immediately." No explanation, no context, just a tone that felt colder than usual. He knocked once, then entered. 4 people sat around the long table, none of them smiling. His direct supervisor, a woman he'd worked with for 8 years, wouldn't meet his eyes. "We received an anonymous complaint," she began. Her voice clipped. "It alleges inappropriate behavior outside of work that may reflect poorly on the institution." Andre blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Allegations of misconduct involving a young woman who recently stayed at your residence." She pushed a file across the table, sealed but heavy with implication. "You'll be placed under temporary review." The room spun, but he stayed still. "You think He stopped. There was no point arguing. Not when the decision had already been made behind closed doors. When he left the building, he noticed something else. A nurse he often shared coffee with crossed the hallway without greeting him. 2 other techs stopped talking when he passed by. The silence wasn't new, but today it stung deeper. It felt orchestrated. Andre picked Isabella up from school that afternoon, only to be stopped by the receptionist at the front gate. "Mr. Soua, there's been an issue with Isabella's tuition account. We've been instructed to withhold cafeteria access until it's resolved." His daughter tugged at his sleeve. "Why did the lunch lady say I can't eat today?" Andre stared ahead, jaw clenched, heart pounding. "You'll eat with me," he said, "every day until this is fixed." They drove home in silence. He didn't play the radio, didn't hum. His thoughts were too loud. The call came just after they stepped inside. Blocked number, no name, just a voice. "You really thought you could use my daughter to get into our world?" Andre froze. "I know who you are, Andre Soua. You picked her up like some stray, fed her, played house, and now you think that makes you worthy? Who is this?" "Richard Whitmore," the voice hissed, "and I'm going to dismantle your life piece by piece." Andre's throat tightened. "I don't understand what." "Oh, you will, I've already started. Your job, your kids' education, your credit, your address, all of it. And when I'm done, even that little girl of yours will see you as nothing." Andre gripped the phone tighter. He didn't speak, he didn't plead, he just listened. "I built everything I have from the ground up," Whitmore sneered. "People like you think kindness gives you access. It doesn't, it makes you disposable." Then came the words that stuck like glass in the chest. "I'm going to take everything, Andre, your job, your daughter, and that sad little roof over your head." The line went dead. Andre stood there for a long moment, phone still in his hand, while Isabella unpacked her backpack in the next room. The hum of her small voice echoed faintly as she sang to herself. He slowly lowered the phone, eyes burning but dry, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something rise beneath the fear. Not anger, not panic, but the quiet beginning of resolve. The blinds stayed closed now. The light barely crept through the slats as Andre sat by the window, watching shadows move outside. A black SUV had circled the block 3 times. A man in a tan jacket stood across the street pretending to check his phone while snapping photos with a hidden camera. Andre didn't need to be told. He knew what surveillance looked like. Isabella sat cross-legged on the living room floor. Coloring quietly, she looked up when another flash went off outside. "Daddy, why are people taking pictures of our house like it's in a movie?" Andre didn't answer right away. He walked over, knelt beside her, and gently smoothed her hair. "Because some people don't know when to stop being cruel, sweetheart." Before she could ask more, there was a knock at the door. 3 times, firm, measured. Andre's body tensed. He wasn't expecting anyone. He stepped to the peephole, ready to send them away. But when he saw her, something shifted. He opened the door. Sandra Martinez stood on the porch, raincoat still dripping, a leather case clutched tightly under one arm. She hadn't changed. Same sharp eyes, same calm fire beneath them. "You always pick the worst times to make the news," she said. Andre stepped aside. "Didn't realize I had." They sat in the kitchen. She placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly, one document at a time. Photos, news clippings, court records. "This isn't the first time Richard Whitmore's gone after someone," Sandra said. 3 years ago, a public school teacher dated his niece, ended up blacklisted. 2 years ago, a black sculptor his daughter met in Paris. Whitmore destroyed his gallery overnight." Andre stared at the papers, each life folded, erased by a man no one dared to challenge. "This is what he does," she continued. "He waits until the person is isolated. Then he squeezes, legally, financially, socially, until they disappear." Andre looked at Isabella through the doorway. She was singing softly, lining up crayons by color. "I've fought this man before," Sandra said. "Indirectly, but we've never had this much. Not with recordings, not with his voice on a line." Andre's voice was low. "You want me to fight him?" "I want you to survive him," she replied. He leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. "I've been through battles. I've stood in courtrooms. I've filed complaints against departments that tried to silence me. I've done all that. And I won, but this," he looked up, his eyes tired. "This is different. He's not coming for me, he's coming for my daughter." Silence settled like dust. Sandra studied him, then reached into her bag and handed him a small flash drive. "This is everything I've got so far. Use it or don't. But don't pretend this ends if you do nothing." A soft patter of feet broke the moment. Isabella walked in, holding a sheet of paper in both hands. "Daddy, look." It was a drawing, 3 figures holding hands in front of their building. One was clearly Andre, tall with curly hair. One was Isabella, and between them Emma. "Do you think," she asked softly, "if Emma comes back, will our house still be here?" Andre looked at the paper, then at his daughter. Her eyes held no fear, only trust. He turned to Sandra, something cold and sharp awakening behind his gaze. "She picked the right house," he said. "He picked the wrong man." And just like that, the quiet resolve became something else entirely. A promise. By the end of the week, Andre's apartment no longer felt like a home. It felt like a war room. The kitchen table was buried under folders, flash drives, and open laptops. One wall was covered in printed emails, call logs, and timelines. A tiny microphone was hidden in the light fixture. Cameras, barely visible, now watched the front door, hallway, and every main room from discreet corners. Sandra had brought in a tech friend from her civil rights network, a quiet man with tired eyes and fast hands who installed a real-time surveillance system by sunrise. Isabella noticed, of course. Children always do. But she said nothing, just held her stuffed rabbit closer when she slept and kept a watchful eye on her father. She knew something had changed. Andre tried to smile like nothing was wrong, tried to cook the same meals, tried to hum the same songs, but every time the doorbell rang or the phone buzzed, his hand moved to the desk drawer where his files now lived. On a Thursday night, as Sandra was going through her notes and Andre was adjusting the angle of the kitchen camera, the phone rang. Unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then picked up. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a shaky breath. "Andre, it's me, it's Sophia." The name hit him like a wave. The voice was even harder, fragile, uneven, not the Emma who laughed in his kitchen. This was someone else, someone scared. "Sophia, are you okay? Where are you?" "I don't have long. I'm hiding in my father's office." He closed his eyes, his body tensing. "What's going on?" Her voice cracked. "He's going to frame you. Andre, he's hired people. They're going to plant drugs in your house. He wants to make it look like you're dangerous, unfit to raise Isabella, unfit to be anything." Andre didn't move. His heartbeat slowed instead of racing. The room became silent around him. "I overheard everything," she continued. "He told someone to do it tomorrow morning. He even timed it to your work shift. He said he's going to make sure you disappear, that no one ever takes his daughter in again." Andre looked at Sandra, who had stopped writing. Her eyes narrowed. She switched the phone to speaker, hit record on a small device. "Sophia," Andre said, his voice steady, "do you have proof?" There was another pause. "I've been recording him," she whispered. "For weeks, calls, emails, everything. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I was scared. I mean, he's my father." She exhaled, shaking. "But after what he's doing to you, after what I saw in your home, I can't stay quiet. Not this time." Andre closed his eyes. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest. The risk Sophia was taking, the risk they were all taking. "Are you safe right now?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I'm using one of his old phones, burner. If he finds out, You don't say another word, Sandra interrupted firmly. You stay quiet. You send what you have to the cloud, lock it down. We'll take it from here. Sophia's voice dropped to a whisper. He always told me people like you were dangerous, that you wanted what didn't belong to you, that you'd take advantage. But that night in your house I saw the truth. You didn't want anything, you just gave. Her breath caught. Tell Isabella, tell her I miss pancakes. The call cut off. Andre lowered the phone. Sandra didn't speak. She didn't have to. The battle had shifted. The empire that had moved in the shadows had just been pulled into the light by its own blood. Andre looked toward his daughter's room. Her nightlight still glowed beneath the crack of the door. He whispered to no one in particular, "Then we fight." At 9:45 a.m. The van sat parked 3 blocks away from the small apartment on Maple Street. The windows were tinted, the engine off. Inside, Andre and Sandra watched the screens in silence. 6 small monitors flickered before them, each showing a different angle of the apartment: living room, kitchen, hallway, Isabella's room. The footage was clean, sharp, time-stamped. Audio synced with each feed. The equipment was military-grade, borrowed from a legal team that usually investigated corrupt corporations. Today, it was trained on a 2-bedroom apartment and a trap carefully set. Andre's hands rested on his knees, clenched. He hadn't said much since sunrise. He'd packed Isabella's overnight bag, kissed her forehead, and left her safely with a retired teacher he trusted, someone whose house wasn't under surveillance. Sandra sipped cold coffee and tapped her screen, rewinding the feed from Isabella's room to make sure the angle was still good. At exactly 9:53 a.m., 2 men appeared on the screen labeled "Back Door." One wore a red maintenance jumpsuit, the other carried a gray toolbox. Neither had been scheduled, neither belonged. They moved like they knew where the cameras weren't. Unfortunately for them, they were wrong. "Here we go," Sandra whispered. The man with the toolbox picked the lock with a master key. They entered quietly, slipping off their shoes to avoid noise. Once inside, they moved fast. One went to the bedroom, the other to the kitchen. Andre's jaw tightened as the man entered Isabella's room. He reached under the bed and pulled out 3 small packages wrapped in plastic. He tucked one beneath the mattress, another inside the closet behind stuffed animals, and the third into a child's sock drawer. Andre's breathing was slow, but his eyes never left the screen. "Get out of there," the first man muttered on the audio. "Hurry, big guy said he'd call in 5, the other replied. Sandra leaned over and hit the record flag on both video and audio streams. At exactly 10:05, a new voice entered the mix, a call to the local police station. Voice disguised but still recognizable. "There's a man," the voice said, slightly filtered. "Apartment 17 on Maple Street. He has drugs, he's alone, there's a child in danger." Then the line disconnected. Sandra tapped her screen. "That's it, they'll move in now." Andre didn't blink. 10 minutes later, squad cars pulled up. But these weren't regular patrol officers. They were accompanied by 2 investigators from Internal Affairs. They moved quickly, entering with a pre-cleared warrant, but they weren't just looking for drugs. They were looking for truth. Inside the apartment, they found the 2 fake repairmen still in place, the drugs planted, untouched, and in the walls, camera lenses stared back. Sandra's phone buzzed. She answered, put it on speaker. It was Detective Morrison, the one briefed the night before. "We've secured the scene," he said. "The footage is clear. The audio matches the voice of the informant. We've run it through filters. It's Whitmore." Andre nodded once, then paused. "Call him," Sandra said. Morrison hesitated. "Are you sure? I want to hear it." A moment later, another speaker came online. Richard Whitmore's voice answered, smooth and arrogant as ever. "Detective, I trust the information I provided was helpful." Morrison didn't respond right away. Then calmly he said, "Mr. Whitmore, this is no longer a courtesy call." Silence. "What do you mean?" "We're initiating an investigation into conspiracy, evidence tampering, and attempted framing of a civilian. We have multiple witnesses, live surveillance footage, and an audio match. I suggest you come in voluntarily." "You can't be serious," Whitmore barked. "I'm Richard Whitmore of Whitmore Holdings. This is ridiculous." "I'll have my attorneys, Mr. Whitmore," Morrison cut in coldly. "This time the one being watched is you." The line went dead. Andre sat back in the van. For a long moment he didn't say a word. Then he let out a single breath, a release years in the making, not joy, not revenge, just quiet, grounded certainty. Sandra watched him. "Your trap worked," she said. Andre shook his head slowly. "No." His arrogance walked straight into the truth. Outside, sirens faded, and for the first time in days, the street outside Andre's home felt quiet again, real quiet. The kind that says something dark has just ended, and something far brighter is about to begin. The smell of garlic and onions filled the apartment as Andre stirred a pot on the stove. The room was warm, the lights soft, and Isabella sat at the table coloring, her legs swinging off the chair, humming a tune with no words. It was the kind of evening that used to be normal, the kind they hadn't had in weeks. On the television behind them, volume was low, but the message was clear. Breaking news scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Billionaire Richard Whitmore arrested in connection to criminal conspiracy, evidence tampering, and intimidation of private citizens. His company's stocks had crashed. Board members resigned within hours. One anchor referred to it as a corporate empire undone by one ordinary man with extraordinary patience. Andre turned the stove off and set 2 bowls of pasta on the table. He sat across from Isabella, who was still coloring. She looked up at the sound of the spoon hitting her bowl and smiled. "You made the twisty kind." Andre nodded. "Only the best." They ate in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that felt earned. Across the city, lawyers were reviewing recordings. Prosecutors were drafting charges. News outlets were printing stories. But here, in this small apartment, it was just a father and daughter eating dinner, without fear, for the first time in what felt like forever. The phone buzzed on the counter. Andre checked the screen. It was Sophia. He answered and put her on speaker. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "and to let you know I did something." Andre raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I took what was left of my trust fund," she continued, "the part my father couldn't touch. I used it to start a fund for families who have been targeted like you were, legal aid, emergency housing, media support. I want to help people rebuild." Andre was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "That's a good use of his money." Sophia laughed softly. "That's the idea." They said their goodbyes. Andre hung up the phone and returned to his seat. "Who was that?" Isabella asked. "A friend," he said. She nodded thoughtfully, then looked toward the television, which had gone to commercial. "Daddy," she said, "how did you know everything would turn out okay?" Andre didn't answer right away. He looked at her small hands, her bright eyes, the way she trusted him with everything. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I hoped, I prayed, but I didn't know." "Then why did you keep fighting?" He reached across the table and took her hand in his. "Because if we don't stand up when something's wrong, the wrong people win. And I couldn't let that happen, not to us, not to you." Isabella didn't say anything. She just squeezed his hand. Outside the window, the city glowed quietly. Somewhere across town, Whitmore sat in a holding cell, his name on every news ticker, his power crumbling one truth at a time. But in this small apartment, the only sound that mattered was the quiet clink of forks on plates and the soft breath of peace returning home. Justice didn't arrive with banners or parades. It came with stillness and a child's question and the quiet strength of a man who refused to disappear. And for the first time in a long time, Andre allowed himself to believe they were going to be okay. 6 months later, the office smelled like fresh coffee and new beginnings. Sunlight spilled through tall windows onto polished floors. The name etched on the glass read the Soua Institute for Justice. Inside, Andre sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of letters, case files, and framed photos of families the institute had helped. It was quieter than the hospital, less frantic than courtrooms, but it carried weight. A different kind of urgency, one built on healing. Isabella burst through the door, her backpack bouncing, a folded newspaper clutched in her hands. "Daddy, look," she said, breathless. "You're on the front page." Andre took the paper and smiled. There it was, his photo standing beside a judge, holding a new grant certificate for expanding legal outreach programs in underrepresented neighborhoods. The headline read, "Former nurse turns justice into legacy." He set the paper down without a word, not because he wasn't proud, but because the work wasn't about him. Across the city, Richard Whitmore sat in a small federal cell. The suits were gone, the nameplate stripped from his office. His calls went unanswered. His children had changed their numbers. The same empire he once used to control and destroy now existed only in headlines and court transcripts, a cautionary tale in the making. Later that afternoon, the front door of the institute opened, and Sophia stepped inside. She looked different now. Lighter somehow, not in appearance but in presence. The weight of old expectations no longer dragged behind her. Isabella ran to her with the kind of smile only children can give fully. "Emma," she shouted, wrapping her arms around her. Sophia knelt and hugged her tightly. "Hey, little sister," she whispered. "I missed you." Andre watched from his desk, saying nothing, just taking in the quiet scene, the way Sophia brushed a strand of hair from Isabella's face, the way the child leaned into her like family, because that's what they had become, not through blood, but through choice. Sophia stayed for a short meeting, dropped off a list of new referrals, and promised to return next week. She left as the sun dipped low behind the buildings, casting golden light across Andre's office. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The skyline stretched wide, full of stories not yet told. And then, softly, like a truth he'd been carrying for too long, he said, "I didn't destroy him. I just opened the door and let the truth walk in." No victory speech, no sense of triumph, just clarity, because the real win wasn't Richard Whitmore's downfall, it was what rose in its place. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.